Upper Pine Creek Bench. I need to give you a little background here. How the Wiese family came to live on Upper Pine Creek Bench. Frank Sildenberg, who happens to be Dad's first cousin, came to our home in Rari, where we were living at the time by the old Pillsbury elevator there, and told my father that Jenny Jacobs was looking for a renter. The rest of the story is history. Now, the thing about that is, you should all know, or will know, if you ever read my brother's book, Jenny Jacobs was the granddam of Upper Pine Creek Bench. She set foot on that in 1899. And he writes extensively about that in this book, Our Turn in Paradise. Memories of Gary L. Wiese. We arrived in the fall of 1940. I was age 4. No electricity. Heat and cooking was by and on a Monarch wood coal stove. The stove had a water reservoir attached that provided hot water if there was a fire in the stove. Light was by oil lamps and gas lanterns. The cream separator was cranked by hand, butter churned by hand. A root cellar and a large garden spot came with the homestead, as did the outhouse. Priority there, of course. And right here, I want to say that that old house also had a pantry. And we used to listen to the radio programs, and I'll get into that a little farther along here. But one day I was looking at that pantry door, and there was a singing, "Life Gets Tedious, Don't It?" Anybody familiar with the song "Life Gets Tedious, Don't It?" Walter Brennan done a good job with that. Anyway, this is the one that stuck to me about that pantry. The song goes, "A mouse a-chewing on the pantry door. He's been at it for a month or so. When he gets through, he'd sure be sore, because there ain't a darn thing in there." And that's kind of how we felt about living in the old Jacobs house up around Pine Creek Bench. In those days, the farmyard provided the fried chicken. Mother would say, "We need a chicken." And then, guess what? I gotta go back here. In those days, the farmyard provided fried chicken. I see nodding heads over here, or chicken and noodles, anytime the cook requested, and she dressed and cooked the bird. How many ladies here, raise your hand, if you've dressed and cooked a bird in the last 40 years? I see some. Beautiful. Great. All right. That's good. Hauling in wood and coal to keep the household warm and fed was a constant labor. Electricity was wired in the spring of 1941. We finally got it. Gloria was lucky she had it in 1936. Only she wasn't born yet, so she didn't know. But she was born soon after that. By contrast, the cruise ranch where Gloria lived, it got electricity in 1936. I should stick to my notes instead of getting off, hadn't I? And guess what? According to her sister Evelyn, they got a modern bathroom when Evelyn was 11, 1941.
Wow.
And that's about the time you were a year old, right, Gloria? You were 2 then, 39? Okay. I used to go over to the cruise ranch. Oh man, indoor plumbing. You know. The 1940 census lists the following residents. This took place in April 1940. It changed some with hired hands and stuff after that through the summer, but this is what I had in April 1940. Mr. and Mrs. Russell Farnes and 7 children. And I might add that their son Glenn, who is 2 years older than me, is here today. He's going to relate a Upper Pine Creek Bench story to us. That's really very special because it involves another member of the Upper Pine Creek Bench, too, and people there. Mr. and Mrs. Roy Farnes and Virgil Cherry. Do you remember that, Glenn? Yeah. Mr. and Mrs. Herman Jessen and 6 children. Mr. and Mrs. Little Herman Jessen. Little Herman was one of those 6 children in the Jessen family. Mr. and Mrs. Earl Johnson and 1 child. I think they must have worked at the cruise ranch briefly or something. They were on the census between Herman Jessen and Hank Cruz. And Then we have and there his sister-in-law, Madge Hutchison, was in there too. Mr. and Mrs. Henry, Hank Cruz, and 3 children, because Gloria had made it before the census, so she was all right there for that. Mr. and Mrs. George Thomason and 4 children. Nathalie, Mrs. Thomason, was Lena Zitlaw McCabe Wiese's sister. You know, Lena lived till she was 102. She always tried to come to the old-timers reunion as long as she could. Mr. and Mrs. Arnold Winterfield, Arnold and Gladys. Mr. and Mrs. Herman Winterfield and two children. And Mr. and Mrs. Frank Humphrey and 3 children. And that April 1940 comprised the residents there in that particular time span. I have a listing here, it's called Survival. Life depended on water on this dry land. The Hank Cruz Ranch and the Jacobs Farmstead, where the Wiese family lived, depended on the spring on the lower part of the mountain behind the Cruz Ranch. In 1899, Dan Jacobs and his friend met an old trapper on the upper bench. The trapper said he had trapped the area for 50 years and never known the spring on Upper Pine Creek bench to run dry. Isn't that, Gloria, is that still where they're getting their waters as that spring still comes down? Tony, you know, still have the cistern there too, the big cistern? Yeah. Okay, all right. We'll get into that a little deeper here too before we're done. And my source for that old trapper story is Our Turn in Paradise by Lynn H. Wiese, page 65, in case you want to refer to it. Cruz had a large cistern to hold water as they had a lot of livestock plus people to sustain. They had the home house, they had 2 hired man houses with families in it, as I remember. Plus, I remember the old viaduct that used to be on the road going over to Jessam's. What, 30 head of horses running under that? That was a sight, 1941. Amazing, yeah. Well, maybe 15 plus colts, that still makes 30 then. I'm getting a little nervous here. I get Audie to get up here and read this. I have to tell you that Audie sends me an email, and I kept looking for the Murphy after that, but I never did find Audie Murphy. So I finally met her, so I know what I'm talking about Audie Murphy. The galvanized pipe from the spring ran to the Jacobs homestead, I estimate about 3/4 of a mile. Tony, what do you think on that old house that way? Yeah. There. And into the house with a tap to control the flow. So we had running water, by golly. You can't believe that, even though it was cold. The Herman Jessen and Arnold Winterfield homesteads, depending on the hauling water from Pine Creek. The Farnes family had a pump on the banks of the Snake River. And Glenn and I remember floating the river, and my Uncle Thomas Gold and my dad, and they said, well, right there is where the Farnes had their pump with a water wheel. So Glenn told me about that the other day. It was ran by a water wheel that pushed that water 400 feet up, you said, the hill, and actually there was 900 feet of pipe to get to the storage, Glenn, and all that. Okay, but that's not what I want Glenn to tell you about. He's got another one that he's going to tell you about there. The farms, yeah, on the Snake River, and the Harry Cruz and Herman Winterfield farmstead had pumps along Pine Creek that filled cisterns and gravity fed the water to homes and farmyards. Delbert said it right. Did Herman have a pump down below where Henry's trailer is there now? Okay, thank you. Yeah. Daily living. Now this is what Audie wanted me to tell about. How was life like on every Pine Creek bench? Well, we said a little bit about that. You needed to have water to survive, at least. For the missus, planning and cooking 3 meals a day, which may include 1 to 7 hired men or thresher crew, whatever. Doing the needed laundry, which would include you didn't have nappies then as you do now, as the English would say. So anyway, they had to do the needed laundry. They cared for the garden. The chickens, that was up from under the household of Mrs. The kids of the household, that definitely was under the missus, and keeping a tidy home. And that's how I remember every home that I went into on Upper Pine Creek bench, or Delbert and Fritz and Mabel's house, wherever we went. Frank and Clara Stoltenberg over here by the river. Tidy homes. And they kept up with all those kids and all those chickens and all that laundry and stuff. Now my grandmother, she had a stand that had a hand wringer in the middle with a tub on each side. My wife has still got her mother's brass scrubbing brush. How many scrubbed clothes on scrubbing brush? All right. Good. Yes. The tradition hasn't died then eventually.
That's my nails.
Just the people that run it, the ones that are dead. That's what you're saying? Okay. For the mister, it was milking the cows and feeding any livestock. Then onto the fields, either prepare and plant grains, harvest the hay crop, or harvest the grains in due season. Then in the fall, it was getting out wood for the stoves of the household, plus trips to the Blindville coal mine up Gray's River. And my wife says, yeah, you blew that. I spelled Gray's River G-R-A-Z-E when it's G-R-E-Y-S for the needed supplies. But I've seen cattle up there now both, so I think they graze it there too. Hunting forays and butchering days were planned to supply the winter meat needs. Cold storage was available either at Rowery or Idaho Falls locations. Now, with electricity, you had a little refrigerator with maybe a small freezer at the top, not like we do now. And so the grocery stores in Rowery and Idaho Falls, and my wife tells me in Teton Basin, had cold storage units. So you get your meat, take it, get it processed, and they'd wrap it, and then they put it in a drawer there, and that was your drawer, and you had a key, and when you went to town, you brought what you needed for the following week or whatever. Pardon? Did we hear something? Oh, okay. Anyway, so that was a real good excuse to get to go to Idaho Falls, just so we could get some more meat for next week. November 41, I got to witness my father render a hog. And now that's something else. I told that at a family reunion one time, and about got run out of the place. But they didn't think their kids should hear about somebody butchering a hog. And I won't go into that here today either, because you might run me out. Yeah. Special memories. Happened to be a Chester White sow. That's what it happened to be.